Right. Good afternoon. Welcome back. I think we would all agree we made a very encouraging start this morning, and I would like to have said a few words after the last panel before lunch, but their expertise was beginning to eat into our lunch, literally. It was an immense privilege to participate in all of the meetings this morning, but the last one I thought was quite extraordinary. The caliber of the speakers, their candor, their openness, and then the quality of the questions was very high, and the enthusiasm and candor again, which the speakers pursued in responding, was exactly what we were trying to achieve in this conference. I hope you all agree. And I'm not singling it out against the other contributions this morning. It just happened to be the only one I didn't get a chance to comment on. So, welcome back. Hope you've had a good lunch. Hope your enthusiasm has not been sated. And in this panel, which I will chair, we're going to discuss current financial and economic conditions insofar as they're the background against which we're discussing all these security issues. But current conditions are far from the total story, because the issues that we're dealing with are basically pretty long term. And over the long term, things can change, and current financial and economic conditions could be significantly less relevant over time. I think back to the last 20 years of the last century, where free market fundamentalism, Anglo-Saxon capitalism spread, if you like. Didn't spread everywhere. The continentals never really bought into it. After all, it was known as le capitalisme sauvage. The Asian countries have never really bought into it. There are different models. And the issues that we're talking about are actually pressuring a number of longer-term changes. So while I think it's very important for us to be concerned about the price of oil and the possibility of a recurrent recession against the fragile background of the recovery, the problems of the Eurozone and the banking system, and other such contemporary issues, the potential slowing in the growth of China, all those things are, yes, of course, very important, but actually we mustn't forget there's a cycle. We also have to accept that the heavy level of debt throughout the world has to be unwound. It's going to take time, hence austerity as a background to the discussions. But there may well be other longer-term shifts that we shouldn't forget, and one of them, the increasing awareness of the private sector and their involvement in the solution to these problems, the spread of corporate sustainability responsibility, the concept of stakeholder, shareholder. But again, a point that was made strongly this morning, the private sector is going to have to take strong initiatives in addressing all the issues that we've begun to talk about. So while we know that nation states function in a diverse and interdependent world, economic growth, social progress, employment and welfare in any country depend on a complex network of trading, finance and cooperation that span national boundaries. We know all that, but it's not only the security of the current global financial and economic system that's going to be critical to our future, but we also have to be aware of the fact that that's dynamic. It's not static, and it's not driven by this current, probably elongated cycle. Another issue that relates to economic and financial conditions was almost touched on this morning when Secretary Chertoff mentioned cybersecurity. And just bear in mind how fragile the world's financial system is against the background of cyber threats. It only needs a malign intervention in submarine cables to bring down financial markets overnight. Because after all, markets are dependent on an ability to price. and pricing is globally dependent on international communications, which are heavily threatened by cyber. So a very specific point. Anyway, to give the background, currently, and hopefully looking forward to these issues, we have a very distinguished panel to look at these harsh realities. Indeed, I may call it a stellar lineup. First, not necessarily in order of speaking, but first, Chile's former president, President Bachelet, now executive director of UN Women, on my left. Recently, she chaired an advisory group convened by the International Labour Organization, which in collaboration with the World Health Organization put forth the social protection floor concept for fair and inclusive globalization. As president, Ms. Bachelet had an exemplary record of successfully extending social protection to the citizens of Chile and promoting child development and gender equality. The social protection floor, as defined by the United Nations Chief Executives Board, is an integrated set of social policies designed to guarantee income security and access to social services for all. Talking to President Bachelet a few moments ago, she indicated that what she wanted to talk about was social cohesion, the development world in the context of security, or vice versa, security and the context of development and social empowerment. And also with us is Dr. Horst Hahn, Chairman Emeritus of the Volkswagen Group. Under his leadership, Volkswagen was transformed into a global corporation by opening new production plants in China and Eastern and Southern Europe. He's an honorary professor for industrial entrepreneur strategies at the University of Zwickau. He can speak to the entrepreneurial side of tackling these global challenges and how private industry can take the lead. Jose Fernandez is the State Department's Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs. In this capacity, he leads a group which works to promote economic security and prosperity at home and abroad. His work, the work of his bureau, lies at the critical nexus of economic security and national security. Talking to him a few minutes ago, security at a time of economic uncertainty. Actually, nobody likes uncertainty, but to quote Goethe, certainty is ridiculous. So I leave that one for you to think about. You were wondering why I was slowing up, because something had just occurred to me that I was trying to drag out, as one does. And then finally, Mr. Randolph, Eddy, is the founding partner and CEO of Ergo, a global intelligence and advisory firm that delivers actionable information collected from frontline sources. He's also a former director at the National Security Council. I'm hoping that he's going to provide some insights about trends in emerging markets and financial flows to frontier destinations. I would also add that he and his firm have got very significant knowledge of the financial conditions and markets which exist in both Iraq and Iran, and it might be interesting if you had a moment to comment on those. So, if I may, could I start with you, President Bachelet, after all? Thank you very much. Whichever you like.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It is great to be here with all of you, and I would like to thank our chair, Mr. Francis Finlay of the East and West Institute, and one of the co-sponsors of this conference. And as he said, this panel is dedicated to affordable security, financial and economic realities, and you may ask yourself, why is this woman speaking here? Well, maybe because I was Minister of Defense, but maybe because I've been working in social protection, and maybe also because now I'm the head of a new entity called UN Women for gender equality and women's empowerment. And because all of these things are integrated and are an essential part also in ensuring a more affordable and sustainable security and peace in the world. We all know that as our world evolves with new technology and more interconnectivity, governments and institutions are having, I would say, a hard time keeping pace with the fast-changing dynamics. institutions with hierarchical structures, bureaucratic procedures, and fragmented and many times with silo approaches are hard-pressed to respond to current financial and economic realities, which are complex and heavily influenced by non-state actors. When I went into study strategic studies in my country, you could always hear that there's no security without development and there's no development without security. But usually we sort of forget a part of the equation. And today I want to point, and as we see it's very important because development and security are essential if you look at how conflicts are being produced, and I'll speak a little bit on that. But on the other hand, when you look at post-conflict countries, I'm not going to say that all because I might be wrong, but almost every country who is in a post-conflict situation are not going to reach the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, are very basic and essential. Let me speak about 4 areas where we can enhance security. I think first, in terms of the economics and dynamics, first we need to reorient the role of governments and multilateral institutions to really respond to today's financial and economic challenges. Because I often hear or read commentators speak about the possibility or even inevitability of another major economic crisis. I hear that the lessons that came not only from the last financial crisis, but even from 1998 crisis, which put more than 100 million people into poverty, have not been learned. And that we needed regulations have not been put in place, and that same activities that led to the last economic meltdown in 2008 and beyond are still being carried out today. If that analysis is correct, it does not bode well for world security and the security of individuals. And it's becoming clear that we need to move towards economic models that focus not only on short-term profit, but on inclusive and equitable growth that protects the environment. And that's why we work on social protection, but thinking on how we can, in a globalized world, ensure a most fairer, inclusive, and just world for all. The United Nations Environment Programme defines green economy as one, and I will quote, that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risk and ecological scarcities. What is clear is that we need to rein in risk-taking behavior and protect citizens from absolute poverty and deprivation. Governments need to make sure that resources are allocated efficiently, of course, but also that the labor force is well educated, that jobs are being created, that consumers are protected, that people enjoy a decent standard of living, and that the environment is protected. But second, and I want to relate also this point, is we need ethical leadership. This leadership was demanded last year by protesters around the world, from those camped in tents at Occupy Wall Street or in McPherson or Square or Freedom Square here in DC, or students and working marching in the streets of Europe, to the people demanding freedom and democracy in the Arab world. And it's no wonder that Time magazine named the protester the Person of the Year. The protesters were calling for ethical leadership, leadership to reduce economic insecurity and inequality, leadership to tackle lack of opportunities and high unemployment, and leadership to uproot greed, corruption, and repression. Because ethical leadership builds political stability and security rooted in peace, opportunity, decent standards of living, and the will of the people. Ethical leadership promotes sustainable development rooted in economic, social, and environmental justice. To put it simply, ethical leadership protects the well-being of current and future generations. When we think that scientists are estimating that sea levels could rise up to 23 inches, that was the IPCC many years ago, and some people are saying that they really estimated even lower than when it could happen, or more, by the turn of the century, and with the effects of climate change already having increasingly serious impacts on development and security, ethical leadership is needed to save us from further economic, social, and environmental crises. If I mention first the need to adjust governments and multilateral institutions to the present reality, the second, ethical leadership as an essential issue, the third thing I want to address is whether we need social protection and job creation. And let me share with you some figures that really amazes me when I read it every time. Because despite 6 decades of strong economic growth and a global GDP that is 10 times larger than in 1950 in real terms, and I mention 1950 because in 1948, the world got together and developed this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But when you compare that time from now, the GDP is 10 times larger. Access to adequate social protection benefits and services remains a privilege afforded to relatively few people. And let me talk about figures. We know that now we are like 7 billion people in the world. Today, about 5.1 billion people. That means 75% of the world's population are not covered by adequate social security. 1.5 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day. 38% of the global population, that means 2.6 billion people, do not have access to adequate sanitation. Or 1 million people lack access to adequate sources of drinking water. And we know that by 2025, 1.8 billion people will be living in countries or regions with absolute water scarcity, and 2/3 of the world population could be living under water stress conditions. And that will lead, of course, to less food production. And everybody says that if we estimate by 2050 that it will have additional 2 billion people, like 9 billion people in the world, that means that we will need 70% more food production in the world. And if we look at where the population is increasing faster, developing world, we will need 100% of increase. And of course, far too many people, especially young people, are unemployed. So security needs to be grounded in inclusive government and growth strategies that deliver goods, services, and jobs to people. The persistence of such large numbers of excluded persons represents tremendous squandered human and economic potential on one hand. We're losing that potential, but on the other hand, a huge threat to security. And this is particularly important in a context of accelerated demographic aging in countries with low coverage of pension and health systems. It is particularly important given rising inequalities with the majority of poor people today, for the first time, living not in poor countries, but in middle-income countries. And that is something very important because 2 decades ago, poor people live in poor countries. Now, 72% of the poor of the world live in middle-income countries. So the extension of social protection, drawing on basic social floors, is a missing piece in a fairer and inclusive globalization. And we understand by social protection that everyone should have access to at least basic health services, education, housing, water, sanitation, and other essential services. But second, that no one should live below a certain income level, and that means that everyone should have access to basic income security guarantees that can be provided in many ways in the form of various social transfer in cash or in kind, such as pension for the elderly or persons with serious disability, child benefits, and or employment guarantees. But when we're talking about social protection, we're not talking about the old concept of assistentialism. On the contrary, we're talking not only about providing services, but we're mainly understanding that when somebody is better educated, have better health, and so on, we are empowering people. We're enabling people for a better job with decent salaries and working conditions. And I can tell you this is possible. I did it in my government. And it's possible, it's feasible, and it's affordable. And of course, every country can choose on the situation where they're starting, how gradually they develop these kind of things. And I have to mention this because if you see the economic crisis, Latin America has come very fast and sooner of the crisis. And there are many reasons to it. One of that, we learned the lessons on the last 80s crisis, but also because we have developed this sort of social protection programs that permitted that we could maintain demand because there was no social crisis linked to financial and economic crisis. In fact, in the long run, and I was mentioning some other things, we studied what does it mean for some countries to develop a big social protection. We did it in consultation with the IMF, and it showed that in countries such as Benin, El Salvador, Mozambique, or Vietnam, major social protection programs would cost between 1% and 2% of the GDP. Major, but you can start lower and then you increase. In fact, in the long run, social protection floors are not only affordable, but that can pay for themselves by enhancing the productiveness of the labor force, boosting the aggregate demand, and therefore generating further tax revenues. So the point here is that social protection programs are part of the equation of a healthier economy and for affordable world security. And my fourth and final point is that we need to place special focus on women and young people as we pursue peace, development, and security. Wherever we look in today's world, we see that where human rights and human dignity are not respected, where there is growing injustice and inequality, there is rising insecurity. Nowhere is insecurity more acute than in countries torn by conflict. When you deploy troops and choose military engagement, it costs billions of dollars. If you can prevent conflict, of course through traditional ways, negotiations, intelligence gathering, diplomacy, but also through investments that improve the well-being of people, you save resources, but the most important thing, you save lives. The best assurance for security is to prevent conflict. The best way to build security is by engaging and listening to people to plan the way forward. So today, two groups are rising up that want their voices to be heard. They want to contribute to a more peaceful, just, and secure world. And I'm talking about women and young people. Half of the world is women. Well, in some places, a bit more than half. In Liberia, it's 53%. In this country, the US, is 51%. And half the world is under 25 years of age. Nearly 90% of youth live in developing countries. Nearly 1 billion live in Asia and Africa. But yet, they are denied equal opportunities and participation. And I think it is time to empower women and young people. Around the world, women educate their children. They are the key to healthy families. They are increasingly entrepreneurs. And many of the characters for new leadership in companies, according to many studies, women do have it, but still they're lagging behind. Wherever I travel, I urge leaders to put more women in decision-making, more women in the cabinet, more women in legislature, more women on corporate boards. But I have to say, it's not only because it's the right thing to do, it's mainly because it's a smart thing to do. So the food, and of course it's also the right thing to do, the food, and I would like to, because something that really impressed me going to the Nordic countries, speaking, because usually they say, when people come here, they tell you, okay, you have these welfare policies, and you have women policies because you are a rich country. And they also always answer no, on the contrary. We are a rich country because include women from the beginning on when we started after the war to develop our countries. So the full participation of women strengthens democracy, peace, and sustainable development. And by advancing women's rights and expanding women's participation in peace building, we invest in affordable world security. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the global economic crisis is a global jobs crisis, and the women and youth are hit the hardest. Unemployment rates for women and for youth are at record levels, 2, 3, sometimes even 6 times the rates for adults if we think on youth. While more youth hold university degrees, their schooling has not equipped them for today's job market, and not enough jobs have been created. And we all know in the Arab Spring, it was about freedom and democracy and liberty, but it was a lot about social injustice and very qualified people who didn't have jobs after finishing tertiary school education. So we have a choice. We can't do much more because the world needs today 600 million new jobs over the next decade. And without urgent measures to stem the rising tide of women and youth employment, we risk creating a lost generation of wasted opportunities, squandered potential, but also increased threats to security. But we have a choice. Young people can be embraced as partners in shaping their societies, or they can be excluded and left to simmer in frustration. Addressing the needs and hopes of the world's women and young people is no longer an option, it's a necessity. So there are no easy answers, but we do know that peace, inclusive politics, development and security are interconnected, but also they are mutually reinforcing. So just all of us in this room are devoted to these issues. So are we at the United Nations and the UN Women. So I look forward to continue participating in this panel, hopefully that we can find a just, peaceful, and secure way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I cannot resist at this stage saying that was a ringing endorsement for spending more money on all the non-defense issues. And you made lots of illustrations. It's affordable, it's feasible, it works. And the little ringer was it actually increases tax revenue. That was something that was a point that was perhaps worth mentioning. But it does seem that it is a win-win situation. It improves everybody's lives and it improves security. So, Dr. Hahn.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here. Good afternoon. And I must say, I feel very depressed after this morning, as it was really beyond my expectations what I heard about an area I'm quite distant from, but nevertheless we all are very closely involved in it. Had this been taken place in a dictatorship, I'm afraid before lunch, most of the speakers of this morning would have been shot. But we are happily in democracy, but democracies must survive too. So when looking at it from a business point of view, I must say, this looks like a lot of mismanagement, no thinking almost, no strategy, and it's about time, we would say, long overdue to change management and to call in McKinsey. But we are here in a different set. I realize this, and I will try to make a few points about the dramatic changes ahead of us when thinking back just 250 years. In this span of 250 years, the world has changed more than during the last 100,000. And in the next 40 years, till the middle of this century, we have to expect again an acceleration. And when we talk about security and acceleration, we talk about a constant increase in cost. This already has brought to implosion a major power quite recently. And the acceleration of technology, not only of geography, the explosion of technology by electronics, by the IT, has, in my industry, of course, brought beautiful automobiles, and we have compensated cost by merging, by changing, by having larger and larger markets. Here in our case, we cannot have any of this, and we must see how this will be in the future. The automobiles cost more and more, but they bring more and more. The weapons bring and cost more and more, as we all know. They cost more and more to maintain, and the price per kill is getting down, so we make a very impressive progress, and it's nevertheless, at the same time, the life expectancy of a new product is going dramatically down, and this again is an accelerator which is further increasing the cost and burden of armament. When you add up all this, mathematically you can count and calculate today when this all will bring us to a complete breakdown. Now, I think, fortunately, we have a new element in this scenery which will permit us to accelerate this breakdown point in order, hopefully, to come earlier to some conclusions and some agreements among intelligent people how to stop this machinery altogether, at least to a very high degree. And when talking about this spiraling cost, we come to a new species of weapons which has the advantage to be dirt cheap and in maintenance also relatively dirt cheap. It's a matter of intellectual elements which permit by cyber warfare to immobilize, to stop, to eliminate weapon systems. But more than that, it is also imaginable already today to immobilize entire economies, that you even don't get to your place of work. And one of the best promoters of this, by making a comment, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said recently, the super weapons are good for attacking, but unsuitable for defense. Well, this shows that the defense is at such a cost that, in my estimate, it's higher than the hardware we are going to protect from all this. So we come now to a point where we have to think, what do we do? And after we have been so unfortunate in almost all our recent wars to have accomplished the opposite of what we had planned. Another proof of this, of course, has been very recently in a war in North Africa. It wasn't a war, but it was the elimination of all our North African allies. Mubarak was our best ally for more than 30 years. He was our friend. And we have eliminated him, and we don't know what we have now to cope with in the most critical area for the sheer existence of our economy, ladies and gentlemen. So there is no other way but now to come, seeing this target, to some conclusion. My conclusion would be we need a group of nations which are in control of the order and safety on this globe. You have NATO on the one side. If you put NATO together with Russia, heavily armed, with a very flourishing armament industry, then of course you wouldn't have enough firepower in order to have a worldwide stability. You just have to think of that east of the Urals, Russia has more real estate than all of China, occupied by 8 million people. This cannot last very long when you see the realities in Asia. So I come back, it was mentioned this morning to my aura, and I have heard very often by very prominent people in this country who from the very beginning are against China. Well, as a European, I know we would have the celebration of the 15th anniversary of a continuous depression without China. It wouldn't be much different maybe in the United States. I wouldn't say this in front of Mr. Stieglitz. He knows better. But in any case, when you consider the wisdom of the Chinese, the way they run their government, the way they progress, what they have accomplished in eliminating poverty in the years past, what they have accomplished over the last 4,000 years in terms of cultural achievements and technological breakthroughs, we have here somebody who has behaved also on the international scene in a most remarkable way. And this is what I consider, if you get China and the United States together, then you really will have a power concentration where nobody in the world could say anything against, and everybody just had to obey. Well, as you all know, this is from somebody from the automobile industry formerly, who is now running kindergartens and other things, very naive. But I am assisted, fortunately, today, by the day. 40 years ago, somebody did something even more naive. There were some Americans, General Haig and Mr. Kissinger, traveling to China, working in China, negotiating with somebody who could hardly speak anymore, Mao Zedong, and with Zhou Enlai as a in-between, and they negotiated history. They negotiated one of the greatest changes we have seen in the last 50 years for peace and stability in this region and for opening up and creating a new world. And this is what I am pleading for. We have today the elements, and when you consider that even among the present and new leadership, you have excellent Chinese trained in the United States, elite universities. You have hundreds of thousands of Chinese who have been here or are here, and we should support that more and more come. So you have enormous elements of community, of networks, to see that we could hopefully make progress in this direction, so that we are not talking anymore about affordable security, but affordable peace. Thank you.
That was extraordinary. Thank you very much indeed. Reminding us that there are other economic models out there, as I was hinting at before, and that if risk and security are equated with risk, there's opportunity. And you've underlined for us a huge area of opportunity. So, Secretary Fernandez.
Somebody's calling. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be here for this conference. I've been a long time admirer of President Bachelet and what she was able to do as first as health minister, and then steering Chile through the 2008-2009 crisis, which is something she had got great credit for. And Dr. Hahn, all I have to say is I used to drive a Passat until I started thinking of government work, and then I decided I ought to buy a U.S. car. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here, and the subject of this session is particularly timely, basically because in times of global economic crises, social mechanisms suffer. And I don't need to go terribly far, and certainly not beyond our own borders, to see what happens to education budgets, to health budgets, to health care, to care for the poor and the elderly when budgets get slashed. And we know that when budgets get reduced, this has consequences for social programs around the world, as the Social Protection Floor document points out. We also know that in order for social programs to succeed, whatever type of social programs, these programs require continued and predictable funding, because when you cut off and reduce budgets, the results are difficult to reverse. And it's not simply a question of putting the budget back where it used to be, but there's a fair amount, there's a lot of ramping up to do when you lose time, and you lose, sometimes you even lose lives. So we need to ensure that programs that work, programs that are successful, aren't really subject to the vagaries of budget short-term funding decisions, which brings us to the subject of this afternoon's talk, and that's how do we deal with the financial and economic reality that threatens funding for social protection programs, or as Mr. Finlay mentioned, social programs in the age of economic uncertainty, with all apologies to Goethe. Well, the good news is that although general development assistance in the last couple of years has in fact risen, our partner countries and the international donor agencies and organizations tell us that there's a growing need for donor-supported technical assistance to help low and middle-income countries look internally to finance their social development programs. And at the same time, there's great interest, there's a growing interest in developing countries to enhance their revenue mobilization capabilities. At the State Department, Secretary Clinton believes, and we all believe, that enhancing the ability of countries to mobilize internal funding is critical for sustainable development. And this is not just because of the of the continuity point that I alluded to earlier, but it's also an issue of fairness. As Secretary Clinton has pointed out, it's only fair that elites in developing countries pay their share of the development costs. It's also an issue at the U.S., political issue. It's hard to justify to people in this country, certainly in the U.S., when they're losing their jobs and they're having trouble making ends meet, that they should also pay for development in countries where the elites do not pay their share, and where countries are unable to mobilize their own resources. And lastly, if you're able to obtain internal resources for development needs, you create a partnership. And the word partnership is one that you will see in all or many of our recent development projects: partnership with countries, partnership with organizations around the world. And I think also it's an issue of ownership. At the end of the day, a country that can pay for its own development will own its own development, and that's important. And so Secretary Clinton, for the last year or so, certainly since the last OECD meeting in May of last year, has been promoting the concept of domestic finance for development, something that in government, because we love acronyms, we call DF4D, Domestic Finance for Development. And that's basically the marriage of three concepts. One is better tax administration. Secondly, corruption, anti-corruption measures. And lastly, transparency. And what do we mean by that? Well, I've talked about tax administration. I've talked about the need for countries to mobilize their own resources. But at the end of the day, there are few governments around the world that can ask their citizens to pay more unless they're also able to convince their citizens that those funds are not going to end up in a Miami bank account because of corruption, and unless they're also able to talk to their citizens about how those funds are spent. And that brings us to the issue of transparency. So we at the State Department are working with our partners in government, with USAID, with several other, to make this DF4D concept a part of our work in selected countries. And we're focusing on 5 countries right now. We're focusing on countries to, first of all, help with technical assistance on tax administration, to create a fiscal transparency innovation fund, which is something that's being created by USAID, to try and work with countries that come up with new ideas to promote fiscal transparency, and to work at the OECD, at the UN, in several other venues on issues of anti-bribery and issues of corruption. A good example of what this marriage of tax administration work, anti-corruption, and transparency can do, I think one of my favorite examples is from Colombia, where, if you recall, those of you who are old enough to remember, 20 years ago or so, Medellin was a byword for one of the most dangerous, to use that term, one of the most dangerous cities around the world. And they elected a mayor, Sergio Fajardo, and in the space of 5 to 10 years, he elevated Medellin from one of the most dangerous cities in the world to a showcase for innovative urban planning and for economic development. And when he was asked how he had done it, he was pretty straightforward. He said, "It's simple. I did it with taxes. We improved transparency in the city's finances," he said, "so more people are paying their taxes. And when businesses trust that we're not stealing, and they know that we're going to use their money effectively, businesses pay. Business supports us because they see how much this can help them." That's exactly what we're trying to do with this triumvirate of transparency, anti-corruption, and tax administration. Another way that we're working on affordable security is to enlist the recipient countries' private sector in development. And I know you've heard about this a little bit this morning. A good example of this is a recent agreement that we signed with El Salvador called the Partnership for Growth. And that basically was a joint effort by both countries to identify two constraints to their development. One constraint was security, the fact that homicides in El Salvador are as much as 60 per 10,000, 100,000 people. That's 15 times what we have in New York, just to give you that example. And the second constraint that was identified by both countries was the issue of competitiveness in El Salvador's economic sector. Well, we came up with an agreement to try and work together to try and deal with both of those constraints. But one of the things that both countries agreed was critical was to enlist the private sector in El Salvador to try and work on these constraints, to try and work on these issues. And so the agreement called for the government of El Salvador to create a council of competitiveness, a council where they identified 10, 12, 15 prominent business people who would become partners in what the government was trying to do. And only by mobilizing the private sector was El Salvador able, would it be able, because it's still going on, would it be able to do the things that they needed to do in order to further their own development that was not going to be limited to business, but was also going to be part of their social inclusion and social development plans. So these are two of the ways that we are working to address the effect of the new and financial reality, that economic uncertainty on social development programs, the F4D and the private sector involvement are only two of those. We have others, such as open government, the Open Government Partnership. For women, we are very much promoting entrepreneurship to try and promote small and medium enterprises, which are, in many developing countries, the vehicles that allow women to enter into the economic sphere. So these are others, and I'd be delighted to talk about what else we're doing on this subject, and I thank you for listening.
You referred to the speeches of the Secretary of State, and I think the one at the Economic Club in New York, she said something along the lines of strategy is economics, and economics is strategic, and strategy is economic. And we heard you describing how effectively now you are exporting US values to foreign countries to allow them to increase their revenues, to be able to pay for their own development. Just as the President here said that implementing her policies actually increased tax revenues. And this is rather an interesting point that's coming out. So thank you very much indeed. I also noticed she'd said in that speech that she was looking for trainees and diplomats in the Foreign Service who not only read foreign policy and foreign affairs, but could work a Bloomberg terminal. That tells us where we're going. So strategy is economic. Mr. Eddy.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's an extraordinarily distinguished panel. It's an honor to be here with the four of you. And Mr. Finlay, thank you for the time that you've put into this as well. This is obviously a fascinating and oft-ignored topic, the one that you were all here gathered talking about today. And it's remarkable to have a group like this to put their mind into it, particularly at a time when there's such extraordinary international tensions. And the lessons that we hopefully will learn from here and other conferences can bring us forward to some success and some of the challenges such as Iran or Iraq that we were discussing earlier. I'll talk briefly about just a new idea and a very old idea. The new idea is something that we've been thinking about a bit, which is about the concept of trying to embrace folks around us in business who can give us great strategy, as Dr. Hahn was saying. We call them Cassandras. Obviously, you recall, in current culture, we talk about Cassandra and we mean Chicken Little, someone who talks about the sky falling in when in fact they're wrong. The actual Cassandra, you recall from Greek mythology, was able to see the future, but was stricken with the inability to convince anyone that she could see it. No one would believe her when she would see horrible things. And in our own culture, we've had a number of Cassandras that have pointed to impending doom and said horrible things are going to happen, but for a variety of reasons, we haven't listened to them. And in those instances, we all paid quite dearly. There's some obvious examples. One that's very poignant here and on the East Coast and across now globally is 9/11. We can think about Richard Clark or John O'Neill, who died on 9/11, Mike Sheehan, a number of other people who clearly saw Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda as a major threat. And even though they worked in very high positions in government, their solutions were not adopted. Not to say they could have particularly prevented 9/11 in the last minute, but it's highly likely that if those points of view, those Cassandras were listened to, we would have not had 9/11. And that story is found in other places too. If you look at Katrina, it's not a national security issue initially when one talks about hurricanes, but when one realizes the kind of devastation a hurricane could have, as it did in New Orleans, one realizes the extraordinary power of being able to foresee these things. Dr. Ivor Van Heerden, who worked at the Louisiana State Hurricane Prediction Center, had talked for 20 years about a Category 3 hurricane coming into Louisiana, into New Orleans, and covering the town in 17 to 20 feet of water. Again, he wasn't listened to when we had the disaster. And similarly, we have a story in Fukushima. And right across the mall here, we have the Atomic Energy Commission, and they've been saying from 72 on that the design of the plants in Japan, particularly the ones that had the most initial damage, were dangerous. In fact, it got to a lawsuit with GE where the designs were no longer promulgated, but the Japanese refused to make the changes. So in each one of these instances, people were able to say there's something horrible going to happen, but they weren't listened to. Now, our culture, we know, is extraordinarily reactive. This isn't a surprise that it takes, as a famous pre-9/11 memo said, hundreds of bodies in the street to drive us to action. But are there other things we can do to embrace these Cassandras? Can we change our methodologies? Can we build things or exclude things internally so that when wise people like this come forward and make the points of view, we'll listen to them and we'll build our strategies based off of what they're saying? It doesn't need to be as complicated as finding soothsayers. It can be as simple as understanding the power of scenaric thinking or building strategy. And I think all of us know that in a very reactive, the life we all live is very reactive, but this government is extraordinarily reactive. And I don't mean this particular administration, but the way the U.S. government works in general is very reactive. And then when you have folks who are in charge with doing scenaric thinking, they often are given the last moment at the last lecture and the last day, and they don't get to share with us the points of view that could cause, could save us from extraordinary disasters. So there are amongst us now current Cassandras. They have points of view, they have ideas and scenarios that we need to acknowledge, and we spend time looking for them, and that's one thing that ought to be considered as we think about avoiding extraordinarily expensive conflicts. If we can foresee the disasters before we get there, that could be of value. So that's a newer thought. An old idea, and one that is actually so axiomatic that I'll be very brief about it, and we can get to this extraordinary panel for questions, is the idea of increasing FDI, foreign direct investment. So at Ergo, we spend an immense amount of time looking at Iraq, emerging markets, frontier markets, and we do look a lot at Iran, not from an investment perspective, but because of its ability to destabilize an extraordinarily important region and a very fragile region. Not that anyone needs to hear it, but a very simple story about the power of foreign direct investment is underway right now in Iraq. There's an oilfield services business that was founded in, I think, 1994 by a local Iraqi. He had come out of one of the major oilfield services businesses and started with very little money. We were able to arrange for him to get $50 million of investment. And think about what $50 million is in the scheme of money spent in Iraq. That $50 million led to 800 new jobs, highly technical positions that are transportable globally. These are not people who are slinging slop. They're actually working on highly complex things. And that investment was something that we believe and hope will have a profound impact on that country. His company, this oilfield services business, is now perhaps one of the most prestigious Iraqi-born companies and is looking towards an IPO or 2 or 3 years, and the valuation will be in the multiple billions. So the wealth creation is extraordinary, but the opportunity and security creation that occurred via that foreign direct investment is also extraordinary. And that's a story that I happen to just be proximate to. There are, of course, millions of stories like that across hundreds of countries, and it's a powerful tool. It's not only powerful and offers great opportunity for the country, but it's also a great wealth generator. Emerging markets investors have been amongst the most successful investors in the last 20 years. particularly ones that got in early and held. And if you look at your charts, the last 12 months have been some of the most profound for emerging markets that we've seen in a long time. The challenge with emerging market investments, there are two. One is simply information access, and the other is security. Two issues that are hard to bring to bear or to deal with, but one of which that might be easier than the other. One thing that we encourage a lot of emerging countries to work on, and when they think about the way they spend their initial donor aid, is to quickly begin to get a handle on the reporting structures of local businesses, particularly larger ones. And if they can come up with a transparent data farm, then foreign investors are able to come in and more quickly understand what companies are of interest or attractive and place their money there. But multiple countries around the world have a very hard time with many of the enabling factors for FDI. And that's obviously why it's companies like ours are in business, but also why some of the work that we've heard about today is so extraordinarily valuable. I'll close briefly just mentioning Iran because we talked about it earlier. When we think about the possibility for violence in Iran, or whatever we want to describe may happen there, we first always acknowledge we're already paying the cost of the volatility there. And that cost isn't simply that we all pay a few quarters more at the gas tank. It's actually having a very obvious impact on the U.S. recovery out of our recent recession. The downside for conflict in that country isn't the obvious that oil, and we work with lots of oil traders, and their answer is, gosh, oil will go to $140 or $300 for 2-3 months. While that's obviously true if there's a conflict involving Iran, the broader sequelae of what could occur is so profound that it boggles the imagination. And to think of an outcome where Israel attacks Iran and Iran doesn't somehow get drawn into a conflict with either the home of the Fifth Fleet of Qatar or Abu Dhabi's Air Force is hard to understand. And if now we have a war where the GCC is brought into the conflict, we're looking at a crisis that would have such profound implications that it would likely draw the entire world back into an economic depression. So all the things we're talking about today and tomorrow and all the challenges that are before us are particularly in front of us in Iran. And we're looking at history in action and the question of if these solutions, if these ideas can be put in place. And we're seeing obviously fairly aggressive diplomacy to get us there. But let's hope it wasn't too late in coming. Thank you.
It occurs to me as an investor that your Cassandras are fundamentally contrarians. Basically, it's the contrarian out there who doesn't get heard, who is the last person to be on the panel. I don't mean that. But I've heard of disasters occurring because of PowerPoint having too much information on a screen, and the least important piece of information can't be read, and that's the contrarian's view. And the contrarian is generally right. So I thought, as I was listening to you, that that was a parallel. And if I can abuse my privileges and ask you, Mr. Eddy, emerging and frontier markets, when your clients ask you about security issues, and I'm talking about classic security issues, not the ones that are being focused on by President Bachelet, etc. What is it that is, the thing that you're particularly drawing their attention to?
Well, it depends on the country that they're in, obviously, and it often has to do with us trying to convince people that it really wouldn't be that dangerous for you to go there, because in the United States we live at such a high level of security, and to some extent a high-walled cocoon that it's hard to convince Americans to go in other places. That's why there's many more emerging market investors with success outside the United States. So it's largely us trying to say, there is a safe way to navigate this country. It's going to be very expensive. And then effectively to think about it as a line item. If you are going to have success with this business, you're going to have a very expensive security bill all the way through, and you have to consider that.
Can I just mix oil in here? What are you telling your clients about going to Nigeria?
I was going to mention Boko Haram, and I actually was curious. How many people in here have heard of Boko Haram? Not bad, in an extremely educated crowd, but we still have maybe 10% of the people who want to admit they know them. And that tells you something about not understanding the Cassandras or the contrarian point of view or looking around the corner. So the United States gets, what is the last number, 7% of its oil from Nigeria? That was a while ago, but a large number. Yet Boko Haram is causing extraordinary threat to that country, and it's an extremely misunderstood or not understood phenomena, that group. And that, why is that? And the United States has set up Africa Command to look specifically at Africa and with a close eye on Nigeria. They're trying to understand the organization. The CIA is trying to understand the organization, but we still don't have our hands around them. And it's because, you know, one would argue we're not very good at chewing gum and walking at the same time. We focus very hard on 2 other wars at the detriment to other places around the world. And now as we're beginning to turn our attention to them, it's a larger force and it's a real risk. So that's one major risk in Nigeria, and the other is obviously corruption. And it's harder to say which is more detrimental to that country.
But also safety. I mean, it's not that safe. You tell people that too.
Absolutely not that safe. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, we've got 20 minutes for questions. I'm just going to leave one out there, which you can think about while other people question. We've been talking about the importance of the private sector. There's another whole sector out there that, in this period of austerity particularly, but over the longer term, I suspect can have an impact on addressing these issues, and that's the whole sector of philanthropy. So can I just leave that for you to think about, see if you've got anything you want to say about that, and whether it is a realistic hope that that will be something that when economies do start recovering, albeit there may be a pause for a while, but when people are made aware, as this audience is being made very aware of something they all knew fairly well, but the significance of these issues to improving the quality of life, which can, as we said, be a win-win situation, whether that will attract more philanthropic money, because I think that that hasn't been brought up yet. So, general questions. Yes, over here.
Thank you. What a great panel. I was struck by the 70% that you mentioned, Madam President. 70% of poor people in countries that are not so poor. I was thinking that our paradigm of security is so focused on the security of states. When you're out of the United States, most of the time you think about the security of people or human security. And business seems to have gone borderless. Certainly our communications have become borderless. We live in a global culture in many ways, and we think of the human elements of markets, sales, capital moving without borders, and yet we still think of security in terms of state security. I wondered if you especially could address the issue of how we can move the paradigm from only state security to a much more holistic definition that the public would understand of human security.
Who were you addressing that to?
Well, our Assistant Secretary of State would be perfect, and Madam President, because Chile is an example of a country that is actually dynamically progressed.
You want to start?
Well, I thought he'd given you the order, Secretary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also that business has transcended the state model and operates in a global, seamless web.
Let's not do business as usual. Let's not ladies first. Please, you first.
I've got some experience with dealing. Well, I was particularly struck by President Bachelet's presentation on a couple of fronts that I think align with a lot of what we're trying to do. President Bachelet mentioned the 7 billion people figure and the need for 70% more food by the year 2050. In our numbers, it's actually a little bit higher. We actually talk about by the year 2050 having to double food production. She also talked about young people, and that actually brought to mind the fact that as I travel around in the last 2 years in the Middle East, especially in North Africa, the percentage of young people who were unemployed, who had very little hope of getting jobs, and in fact, the more educated they were, the harder it was for them to get a job. So it was really that structural unemployment. That brought, obviously that presents a security risk, but I think with all apologies to the Cassandras, I think it also presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity for business, because if you look around the developing world, emerging markets, what they're mostly interested in these days is creating jobs and infrastructure. Power plants, roads, electricity. That presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity for American companies to, either in the agricultural field, to work on things like biotechnology, biotech, ag biotech, to work on infrastructure. And U.S. companies, U.S. businesses are not taking advantage of that. You go around the world, you go to North Africa, you go to Indonesia, and the power plants are being built by the Germans, by the Koreans, by someone other than the U.S. companies. So what we've been trying to do at the State Department with the new economic statecraft directive that Secretary Clinton has given us is to basically work on development as a business opportunity, as a way of doing good and also doing well by U.S. companies. And I think as we look at security, as we look at ultimately the need for development to create security and for security to be necessary for development, I think we cannot forget that it's also an imperative and it's also an opportunity for U.S. companies to do business around the world.
I don't understand why state approach could be different than human security approach if we do understand that the essentials of security is not only about guns. It's the potential of the country, the potential economical, but mainly human capital, because that's what moves the economy, is the human capital. The innovation comes from human capital. Everything that is supposed to be sort of the silver bullet for the economy to grow, for the recovery of the economy, is the people at the end. But I don't know why. Maybe because, unfortunately, in many areas, security issue has become an issue that is not an open issue to everyone. It's not, I mean, in my country, we changed it in the Constitution to say that the militaries were not the ones who guarantee security in our country. They were all the people. I mean, and of course, government, civil society, militaries too, but not the only one. So I mention this because I've been in the sector. I've studied strategy. I have been Minister of Defense, and I like it. I enjoy it being Minister of Defense. But I always understood that the best defense for Chile was to be the best possible country in terms of whole comprehensive potential developing. That will give us the biggest security, but also to have the best relation with all my neighbors. And that the best that would have happened to me is that my neighbors are well, because when the neighbors are having a problem, sometimes security is used as an excuse to hide internal problems. So I would say, why? Maybe because security is not an issue of certain sector. Security is an issue linked with peace, of course, effort, but it should be the sort of things that everybody should be talking about. Public and private sector, people linked directly in the security sector, but of course, people working in many other different areas. The second thing is that we do not discuss security usually with important trends that are happening in the world. I tried to mention some of them when I mentioned the challenges for security in terms of the conditions where people are living. And many of these radical groups, like the one you mentioned, but some others in other places, they are able to grow because of the people who are living in so precarious conditions. They have nothing to lose. So they go into terrorist attacks because they have nothing to lose. So it's so linked really to this. But also, for example, if we're going to go into, in 2050, into 9 billion people, and if you see the trend of population that is increasing dramatically, but mainly in countries that are not rich countries because of lack of, I mean, this is discussion that we need to look from all points of view. And I know this can be, for some, controversial. But if we don't look at family planning and health and reproductive and sex and reproductive health, we will, I mean, we cannot. We are just a planet. We cannot grow and grow and grow without water, without energy and food shortages. We will have security issues. So if we link and we see security only from one very small perspective, it won't work. And we need, in order to work and ensure not only affordable, but sustainable security and peace, we need to make this issue a broader issue, everyone working on this and looking at the different perspective that will contribute to a safer or not world.
It sounds very much as if South America, generally speaking, is taking the lead in this.
Well, we're trying.
Please, Dr. Hahn.
May I make one remark as far as this is concerned? When coming to the United States, I am of course always struck by the obvious waste I see. The engines are running, the driver is waiting. The lights in the hotel are all on. The room in winter is overheated, in summer it's overcooled. So the dishes are full of food, half of it goes probably in the garbage can. We have found out even in Germany, we have now 80 kilos of food being wasted per person per year, which is, we thought we couldn't afford it. This just in parenthesis. I think there's enormous potential in this country for saving when you have the average fleet fuel consumption per vehicle from Europe. You would cut down your fuel bill in a very dramatic way. But let me get back to the other countries where we invest. Of course, we are not investing in a country where we don't find security. This is certain. But we have invested in many countries. I take as an example for this Nigeria. We left Nigeria. But I take it also, we have 90 factories now abroad. In my days it was 50. And in all these countries we have introduced the German standards of water, of air, of security, of health care with doctors on the factory premises and with training apprentices. And we in all development countries have created enormous chain reactions. Today, almost every director of a car plant in China comes originally from us. This goes to the point, we trained a young Chinese engineer in our Audi factory in Germany. He is now Mr. Wang Gang, Minister of Science and Development, which is a great compliment for Audi too. But apart from this, so we always tried to have a policy of being good citizen, but I must tell you that the American automobile industry is doing at least such a good job as we do. They also have developed, and they were the first going global as automobile manufacturers, coming to Europe, coming to South America and Asia and so on and so on. So this is a dynamic industry, and business in general is spearheading and ahead of politics in most cases, creating also political developments by their policies. It's just our mission to go and try to create more business and creating employment and benefits of all of this.
Questions from the floor. Can I go there first? Thank you. Come back here. Yes, David. Yes? Right.
Wait for a mic.
Right.
David King, Oxford. My question is addressed to Jose and perhaps to the President. The British government, perhaps surprisingly, has maintained the momentum to carry its aid budget up to 0.8% of GDP. It's the only part of our budget that is annually being increased now. And the basis of this is, I think, a full acceptance of the notion that the private sector has to play in development. But it's a commitment that the British government made some time ago to take Norway as the benchmark and to come to other countries. We did this at a G8 meeting and say, will you come with us? Now, am I hearing that the United States is saying we don't need to do that? That we can do it through the private sector, and the aid process is not required to manage the kind of poverty that we know still exists around the world?
Of course not. I think we are committed to aid as a number of other countries are. We believe in the benefits of aid. We believe in that it's been successful. But we also believe that you need to do more, that it's not just enough to provide funding, that you need to find ways to leverage.
I agree with that, but my question is, and in that case, what should the aid percentage be from the United States?
Well, I'm not. You've got the wrong guy. I'm the business and economics fellow, remember? But one point that I do want to stress is if you look at what we've done, for example, and things that we're very proud of, Feed the Future, the Global Food Security Initiative, what we've done in countries such as Haiti, we've come through with our commitments, and we believe in what we're doing. But I think it's also important that we need to look for new ways, and that's why I do want to stress the need to leverage the private sector, to leverage other sources such as domestic resource mobilization, because I guarantee you that no matter what the percentage is that developing countries provide, it won't be enough in the short term, and we need to do more, and that's what we're trying to do by looking at the private sector and looking at other sources.
President Bachelet?
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of the U.S., of course, but what I've seen in discussions is that when there's always a conflict, there's not a problem to get the money, but it's very difficult to get them. I'm not talking about the U.S., I'm talking international community. And it looks like conflict, I mean, of course, everybody has the responsibility to protect and the responsibility to answer to that conflict. But many of them could have been so prevented. And not giving money to development and giving money only to the conflict is the reactive kind of response that you were mentioning. And I think we could do it much better. So I think there is a tension in many places where there is sort of also a, because I see it, I mean, many Americans, I think if you ask Americans how much money they give to the UN, probably people will, from the budget of the UN, people will believe that it's tremendous. I don't remember the exact number. I think it's like 0.3% of the fiscal budget, something like this, or less. I have to say that UN Women, our regular budget, the money that we receive from UN, is 1.4%. All the rest is through voluntary contribution that I have to fundraise. And when I was President of the Republic, I thought that everything was through money on the UN. And now I discovered that, no, you have to get it. Nobody told me that before I came to this post. I have to say that. but now I'm developing other skills I didn't have before. But the thing is that that's the reality. But the deep mistake, if we do not do more, we do not invest more in development, we have to do it better. We have to find what works. We have to be very self-critical. We have to say, as David loves to say, value for money. All of that, result-oriented, manage it, and so on. All of that. But if we don't do that, I mean, it will always be, we will be too little and too late, really.
We've always got to remember that it's not only development and conflict, but there will be inevitable disasters around the world. Inevitably, and people forget that that is something that takes aid money of all kinds. There was a question here.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. The problem that has been bugging me since we first went into Iraq, when the commandant from the Marine Corps came back, I was at the Center for Naval Analysis at the time, and I said, what is it you need? And he said, jobs. That was almost 10 years ago. I think jobs is the #1 issue worldwide. How do we create them? What are those jobs? And who is really talking about what you need to do to get large number of jobs out there, and what's the right kind of balance?
One word would be growth, but over to you.
I don't know. Secretary Fernandez probably has a great idea on that too. Yeah, well, certainly the entire global economic cycle has to grow for there to be increase of jobs, and particularly in emerging markets. I think in the Iraq circumstance, that Marine general was exactly right. And the fact that we didn't think about economic development correctly and with the right type of personnel, and it had taken it away from AID and given it to DOD, was an extraordinary disaster, and it played itself out. Now we have a whole new set of challenges, some of which we brought on ourselves in Iraq, right? I think you can make a strong argument that the rise of sectarianism in Iraq happened because the U.S., after we won the war, withdrew the troops so quickly, left basic civil services and others to rot. And then we had Sadrites and others come out to begin to create these sectarian rifts that weren't there before. But I'm only saying that because I don't know the answer to your broader question. I know one thing that's obviously worth paying attention to, and I'm sure professionals like Secretary Fernandez and others think about it, is certain investments obviously yield better and more higher trained professionals than others. So in the United States, we talk a lot about, if we strike the F-35 fighter, that means we'll lose this many jobs in Mississippi or in Alaska. But the reality is, as you know, that defense dollars, as far as being part of economic stimulus, are actually extraordinarily weak versus other types of expenditures. So one thing that's interesting in Iraq is this opportunity, because of that point, to become, again, the breadbasket of the Middle East, which it used to be. So there's a great opportunity for farming in that country, as there is in Egypt and other places that need jobs right now. And as we're looking at global food instability and insecurity, that's something that we need to think more clearly about, and how to enable those jobs in the farming sector is one opportunity for strong employment.
Secretary Fernandez?
I would just add that one way that Secretary Clinton has been very adamant about that we need to focus on is women. And in North Africa, which is where I've been spending a lot of my time lately, we're looking at, as I mentioned in my talk, small and medium enterprises, looking for small investments. And in many of these countries, money is not the issue. It's creating the types of jobs, creating the type of educational opportunities. You have women in some of the North African countries and even in the Gulf that today are comprise more than 50% of the educational, of the college graduates. So you've got one way that we're looking at is how do we promote the entry of women into the workforce? And if you can do that, you can make a significant dent in the employment issue.
He made my job on women, so I will speak on behalf of my experience as president. First of all, I think it will depend country to country, but there's something that usually happens is that countries have global policies, national policies, and one of my experiences that we started looking at, and we created this commission of competitiveness, but we went region by region of the country, analyzing its opportunities, its weaknesses, the kind of mega projects they needed, and try to identify which will be the clusters that we needed, and that it was based on their own, I would say, strength. But on the other hand, we made a study of the market, world market, to see which opportunities there were there. And third, you need to analyze education, because maybe you are producing a lot of people that don't have any possibility in today's market. So you need to look at on the comprehensive way, and it works. It really works, and we develop public-private sector, these common regional development councils, and in the National Competitiveness Council, and we supported private and public sector areas that we identify as the essential ones, or because it was based on their potential, or because it was based on market needs worldwide and the potential of the region. So, it has to be sort of the lowest level you go into the analysis, and also that how you can do it with women and men. So I think there are possibilities, but I have to say, though, that one of the problems, I think this is the most pressing problem of today's world. First of all, because of with the technology and all that, the kind of typical, we saw it in our investment, big investment in Chile, foreign investment, very few job places, because they was very technologized. They didn't need so much human force. But on the other hand, one of the biggest difficulties, it takes longer to recover jobs after any crisis. So it is, but we are dealing, I think, with a challenge on jobs, on the developing of modern economy that needs a lot of thinking, because in a country like ours, we found that way, but probably in a country like the US, you need to do much more.
One more question. That's it? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Phyllis Bennis from the Institute for Policy Studies. I wonder, if I could go back to the question of Cassandra for a moment and look at one of the problems, which is the question of inequality on a global scale. And I appreciated very much, President Bachelet, you're referencing both the Occupy movement and the Arab uprisings, which have really put the question of inequality very front and center of all of our agendas. The question it comes to stare us in the face is about security. Security for whom? If we look at Nigeria was one of the examples. Boko Haram has been far less damaging to most people in Nigeria than the government of Nigeria and Shell Oil together, who have created far more problems for far more people in that country. So the question when we talk about security, for whom? If it's security for U.S. or European corporations, that's one thing. We can build walls like they have throughout Iraq that has made it much safer for Americans to go about in armored convoys, but Iraqis can't get anywhere from anywhere because of the checkpoints. So it's security for whom, against what, and who benefits?
Yeah, but this conference is security for everybody, and it's covering both types of the security, as the question on Nigeria was too.
I agree, but I'm saying that I think our vantage point has been, how do we get security for foreign direct investment, for instance? How do we get security to send money in? We're not so much looking at how do we protect the people of Nigeria from the environmental devastation brought about by Shell Oil and the killing by the Nigerian army at the behest of Shell Oil of environmental activists, for instance, just for instance.
Donald?
I think it's clear that any of the atrocities you described at the end, by any country, any regime that's full of corruption and paternalism and maybe being too cozy to different business interests is abominable. And I think that's something that in no way are we supporting. I think what we're talking about is, Boko Haram, just as an example, doesn't, it kills civilians. The security and the risk that it's causing right now in that country is one that's felt by everyday people in the wrong regions. And I don't think that, I think that you can, it's a virtuous circle. So by increasing the security in the country, reducing pretty much the frontline risk, if it's in the newspapers, it's going to mean investors are going to pull out. So if you can reduce that as much as possible by reducing the threat of terrorist groups, and I don't think you disagree that Boko Haram is a terrorist group, then not only are you making life better for the populace, you're making it easier for foreign direct investment into the country, and that also has a virtuous cycle. I think we believe that bringing investors, the example I used about the oilfield services business, I mean, yes, they're helping the country extract their natural resources. There's 1,000 points of view you could talk about why oil extraction is a bad thing, but what we're focusing on and what we're excited about is 800 skilled, new employed, multi-ethnic employees working together. So if there isn't the ability for them to work securely, that's not going to happen. So if so I think I disagree with some of your premise, but I think we agree that the security is necessary for both goods.
Something to add?
Well, I would just add on the security that you can't. It is a virtuous cycle, and the number that comes to my mind is when we looked at the Salvadorian situation recently. One of the numbers that struck me was if you were able to reduce crime, insecurity in El Salvador by 10%. This is in the country that, again, had 15 times the murder rate of New York City. If you were able to decrease that security by 10%, which meant that people could go to work without getting on buses where they thought they were going to get robbed on payday or having their buses burned if the drivers didn't pay ransom, if you could decrease it by 10%, you would increase GDP by 1%. In a country of GDP growth of 3 to 4% a year. That's huge if you try and break that cycle of poverty. And so I think part of the challenge is, yes, we can look at the Cassandras, but ultimately, how do you get into that virtuous cycle? How do you break that vicious cycle and get into the virtuous? And so I think that's a challenge to us all. And you point out the need for security to be a broad concept, and I think we all would agree.
Last word?
No, you.
Absolutely.
Oh, I just wanted to add that if somebody, we all need to do what we have to do. International community, governments have to do the job, and they have to That's why I think it's a more comprehensive, it's a more difficult thing to ensure security. And I always remember, you know, Al-Shabaab in Arabic means, Shabab means young people, not youth. And Al-Shabaab in Somalia, they are, they are recruiting people on the camps. And the camps are there for 20 years. So one of the problems of not solving comprehensively issues, politically first, and of course economically and so on, is that we are going to do a humanitarian, but without solving the problems and producing a lot of people who could go in because they have no hope, no chances. So I truly believe that government has to do better. And I have to improve in all levels, economic, politically, social, and environmentally. And the international community and the security sector should include in their vision all these aspects, because otherwise it's not working. I mean, first of all, it won't work. We won't be solving the problems. We will be spending a lot of money, and we won't be producing any virtuous circle. So we need to work better, and we need to look at security in a more inclusive and comprehensive way.
Let's thank this extraordinary panel. So, tea break.